Welcome to the UST Education recorded webinar series. This session is powered by US Transactions. UST is a boutique payment processing firm providing you with personalized service. We offer agnostic, best fit technology solutions for associations, nonprofits, and enterprise clients.
Happy to be here. Really looking forward to our discussion on this subject, and would like to encourage people to jump in, both through the chat, and we'll be asking some questions as we go through. And if you would like, you can even ask to be unmuted and participate. We'll just do a quick introduction. Paul will go first. I'm Mike Gelman. I'm out of the Washington, D.C. area. Spent most of my career in public accounting, but working only with nonprofit organizations. But I've been on the consulting side, working alongside the C-suite and auditors and tax preparers throughout that with nonprofits and NGOs. About 7 years ago, started fiscal strategies for nonprofits, still working with CPA firms I've been involved with in the past. And we sit there supporting the C-suite, sitting between the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, and CSO, Chief Strategy Officer, working with sustainability, continuity issues in and around financial planning, budgeting, and strategies. About 5 years ago, started sustainability education for nonprofits. I just sent out a link. You'll see it here. That's an all-volunteer effort. We post every week information on fiscal, financial, legal, and governance issues. I divide my time now into thirds, about a third doing consulting work, as discussed, a third doing classes like this. I really enjoy that part of it. My home base for that is out of Georgetown University here in D.C., but also do a lot with ASAE and a lot of groups, state CPA societies and different organizations like United Way, National Urban League, and such. And my wife and I try to allocate a third of our time to be active volunteers, sitting on nonprofit organization boards, working on being an active volunteer, helping them alongside of the subjects that we're talking about here today. We really feel like you get a lot more back than you give, right, Paul, when you get a chance to sit in with these organizations as a volunteer. I'll throw it back to you.
Thanks, Mike. My name's Paul Preziotti, and I'm a partner with Johnson Lambert. A little bit about our firm. We're a national CPA firm that provides audit, tax, internal audit, and consulting solutions for nonprofit organizations. Similar to Mike, I split my time up. My day job, which is this, providing audit and consulting solutions, doing presentations. Echo Mike's comments on serving on boards. It's really shaped my perceptions in terms of how I deliver services to the nonprofit community, and it's fun to give back. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this presentation. And audit committees, Mike, this is a topic where I think a lot of people maybe erroneously assume an audit committee is just that. We're going to review the audit results, we're going to guide the audit, that's it. And I really think there's a host of many more benefits that you can get out of this committee. What do you think?
I 100% echo what you say, Paul, and I don't think there's probably not a person on the planet that hasn't heard about audit committees, and they know that they're important, as we're going to talk about here, but I don't think they put the word value added next to it, and we want to talk about changing their perception so they can see how these audit committees doing their function around the audit process is extremely important. We do not want to downplay that. But because of that skill and knowledge set, wouldn't you agree, Paul, they can do even so much more, and that's what's going to be the theme of our presentation.
Yeah, and I think too, it's just, guiding them, giving a path to that value added they can provide. And we'll talk through it as we go through the slides. But if you have any questions, if you have any comments as we're going through, please don't hesitate to chime in the chat.
And Paul, as we walk through this, we're going to start with some of the structural side of this and how it looks, but we want to talk about the perceptions related to that. Because you know how, Paul, don't you agree? We see this both working with volunteers and as volunteers ourselves. You have to get past that barrier before people can start to say, wow, what else could they do and such? And we'll key in on the value added part. So the organizations, the key theme here is being effective. We're going to break this into three key areas. We're going to spend about 10 minutes in each area. The first part might take a little bit longer, Paul. I think it's important that we get through the basic building blocks. And then we have some quick takeaways at the end that we think will help in this process. You'll see at the end we'll spend about 5 minutes each on audit planning calendars and auditor continuance. But we want to really start out with this first topic, breaking down the purpose of an audit committee and stuff. And Paul, I think these are the four purposes. You and I live with these audit committees, but also just to double check it, I checked in with AI CPA and AI real quick, and it's uniformly A, B, C, and D here. It's an independent governance body. We're going to break these down, and they're there to manage the financial audit process. And the order of these is pretty rote. Wouldn't you agree, Paul? Then risk management, and then how do we approve?
Yeah, when I think about an audit committee, what I see on these slides, this is what originally comes to mind here. And we don't want to minimize that during this presentation. These topics are very important.
And so, Paul, I think what we want to get to is there's this element. We're going to talk about audit committee orientations, but I think the more important orientation, we'll talk about this later on, is getting the board to understand, what that audit committee is as a tool for them. But independence, Paul, I've learned so much from you because you're coming out of the audit environment. Don't you think the top line is the most important, that we have to both in actual and perception be free from influence?
Yeah, I think that goes without saying, not only when you're talking about an audit committee, but frankly, any member of a governance structure, right? We always want to have independent thought, and that's extremely important.
Exactly. And you'll see down here the independence is, I think there's three sort of levels, Paul. Where the committee is independent from the board, and there's not that many committees. Nonprofit organizations usually uniformly, if they're going through an audit process, will have multiple committees. But where the independence of the committee is core to it. But it's also independence from senior management, and I think a third tier is from staff and such. And we're going to see that when we talk about the composition. But this key part here, Paul, I think it might be worthwhile to spend a second here on that finance committee, because audit committees and finance committees, and we'll talk later on how some organizations might combine the audit and finance committee. But when you have the two, it's sort of interesting how to give some guidance to them. And Paul, think about this. I was, through the website, we were having a podcast on this the other day, and think of an audit committee as is safeguarding the assets, right? Okay? And the finance committee is managing the assets. And they're really two different things. And it's good to have that separation. And then another way to look at audit committee and finance committees, audit committees are generally looking back on the financial reporting and what has happened. And finance committees, I hope, are looking more forward, using it on budgets and planning and strategies. And then from an oversight perspective, audit committees are oversighting the audit process, and the finance committee is oversighting financial reporting. And then where they come together, Paul, I think, is they're both key on continuity, helping the organization support its mission, and protecting your my favorite subject, which is the reputation of the organization. So just to help people to sort of see why the two committees are there. But I think a lot of board members don't understand the difference between them and such.
Yeah, and that's why it's good to have the objectives for each committee laid out and to go through them as an exercise at the beginning of each fiscal year. And to Mike's point, that's not to say you can't have a combined committee, and we'll talk about it, but
right.
If you do, it's very important you have those objectives outlined.
So Paul, you've had so much experience working with audit committees, but also, on both sides of it, the managing the financial statement audit process. I sort of like these steps here. Do you have anything that you wanted to, start out? But I feel like a lot of groups miss that initial, having that extra upfront meeting, which is an optional meeting, just more of a planning meeting, not even getting into that risk assessments. But don't you think there's a lot of benefit, reaching out with the audit committee and just sort of lining up calendars and touching base?
Well, you'll never miss that with Johnson Lambert. Besides those self-serving comments, though, I do think it's important, right, to have a relationship beyond the standard meetings, right? And you can see this list here probably does look familiar to everybody in terms of going through audit planning, getting draft reports. But beyond even the audit plan, I think just on a relationship level, if you have that dialogue with the auditor, let's put it this way, Mike, how is it going to hurt the process?
Exactly. And Paul, think about this way. this second one where the risk assessment, huge meeting, but because of the nature in that, you don't really get the chance to like establish that rapport. And so I like to have pre-risk assessment meeting early on. And this is where you can make the life for yourself and the auditor better, which means less time, right? Less bottlenecks and such. And so think of this as a giant circle that these steps are there. The risk management process and the oversight, Paul, you go always and help me out with this. Organizations have formal policies. It's those practices that don't always get documented, and hopefully they get into an accounting, policies and procedures manual and such. But I think having a way to highlight your practices with the auditors can read your policies. But it's a chance in those meetings to talk about the practices. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and you can get really sophisticated with this if you have enterprise risk management, some sort of process like that. But at the highest level, just giving your auditors your perception of risks, what's changed, that's going to help to guide them and be more effective in their role.
And Paul, I think it's a chance for the committee and the staff and management to say they have a commitment to enterprise risk management, internal controls, and to be able to verbally talk through it, not just hand them the policies and some of the written practices to talk through those challenges and things. So I think that comes to play here when you can verbally show that. Approval authority is interesting. I think there's two branches to the tree, Paul. What approval authority? And I don't know, and I think this is peculiar to the organization where the audit committee has is charged with accepting an audit on behalf of the board, or is charged with going through the process and making a recommendation to the board for acceptance or non-acceptance. But I've seen it both ways. Paul, how do you sort of track this?
Yeah, I've seen it both ways too. The pros of presenting draft reports to the board are the board has full approval. If you ever think they might change, that's a pro. Versus sending them the finals, the audit committee's taking ownership. I think it's knowing the personalities, knowing the potential for changes. That's how I'd shape my decision if I was making it.
100% agree. I think, Paul, I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit. I think for organizations that might not have a long history with audits and things, it might be better for them to go the recommendation to the board, and then the board comes in and affirms and acts on that recommendation. But you'll see later on. But it becomes a little bit more of a two-step process, and the good side of that is it forces the board to to engage a little bit with the audit process, even though the audit committee will be shouldering most of it. Okay, who sits on the audit committee? This is an interesting one here. There's no set stage, but Paul, I think the ideal size is no less than 3 and no more than 5, and it's got to be an odd number. So I think you're always picking between 3 and 5. Would you agree with that?
Well, you want an odd number for votes. That's rule number one. Yeah, I mean, it also comes down to availability, right? Because you don't want to risk not having a quorum for these meetings. So that's the pro of going to the higher side of it, right, Mike? But I mean, if you can make 3 work if you know everyone has availability, if you know they're going to be active, be engaged. Again, it all comes down to knowing who's on the committee. Mike, we did get one question in the chat that I did want to bring up. And the question is this: what's the best practice for approval authority? And I believe that's going back to what we spoke about on the previous slide. Again, do want to emphasize there is diversity in practice. I probably see 50-50 audit committee approving versus board approving drafts. If I was starting from scratch, I'd probably present drafts to the board, right? Because that's the safest option. That way, if there are changes, you can process them. There's no issues there. And then I'd consider changing it later on based on knowing. But yeah, if you ask me to pick one, I'd present drafts to the board. What do you think, Mike?
I 100% agree. I think it's the safer route. And it's that little bit of a perception, like getting 2 people to sign off on a contract or such. You got the audit committee recommending approval and then the board coming in and approving. So it looks, just from a public perception point of view, I think it looks and it's actually stronger down the road. But again, it's to the organization, the governance structure, and such. So yeah, I would start with the other one. You're never going to go wrong with the other one. You're eliminating a step if you can go, the audit committee can approve, and sometimes that's really critical for timing and things. Paul, back to the size here for a second. I think, not that it's specifically here, Sarbanes-Oxley we sort of look at. And a lot of times I say when it comes to nonprofits, there's rules that definitely apply, but a lot of times you can look to SOX for sort of a best practice area. And under there, who sits on the audit committee for nonprofits, it's supposed to be predominantly populated by board members. And it can be all board members. But I think it's also, there's an element of having a non-board member or two on there for another set of eyes. And we might also be able, the best part, and you'll see we're going to talk about this later on, is to bring in the eyes of something where we might not have that board expertise. And we can bring a non-board member on. But I think, Paul, would you agree it's made up predominantly of board members, if not all? And then preferences is to not have the board chair and the treasurer if you can do that. So you could separate out the finance committee and get that sort of independence that way in thought.
Yeah, I agree. That's best practice. That said, in practicality,
Yeah.
I've served on a lot of committees where my original introduction to them was through a finance or audit committee. And I think as an added bonus, that's a good tool for recruitment, right? If you want to find out if someone's a good fit for your organization, maybe start them, and they have the expertise and skills, maybe start them out on the audit or finance committee, right, Mike?
Exactly. Yeah, bring in some of these. And I just think it's that independence of thought is heightened when we have some non-board members on there. But I think what you're generally looking to is it's mostly populated by board members. And Paul and I, we sort of talk about the perfect world, but Paul, the perfect world doesn't exist all the time. What works for your organization? And in a perfect world, you'd not have the treasurer or the board chair on there. So the independence of that committee is there. But sometimes that's really hard for a lot of nonprofits because you almost have to find two treasurers, the person with the capability to be treasurer and serve on the finance committee, and another person to chair the audit committee who has, strong financial background like a treasurer. And that might be hard to get. But as Paul says, the flip side of that is you have a way, if they've served on the audit committee, they can come on to the finance committee and vice versa. And it just, provides that. So thinking about that. Paul, one quick comment on the staff liaison on the bottom. I think it's important to think about that. I mean, I think it's sort of a no-brainer that it's someone in the finance department, there. But just think about that. And it can be, notice there's an S on there. It can be more than one staff person assigned to sit in on these committees.
Yeah, and so we had one other question come in. That's a good one. And the question is, what's the risk of including a non-board member in the audit committee? I don't know that there is really any explicit risk. Going on along my line of thinking, it could be not knowing them as well, not having experience with them. That's the first thing that comes to mind for me. Mike, any commentary?
Yeah, I think mine is sort of the same way, Paul. Is that if it's an unknown, it could create a disruption if they get to a point of not understanding the organization, going off on a tangent in an area and such like that. But I think the benefits, as Paul and I outlined, outweigh the risk. But I don't think there's very much. And I think it's worth repeating, Paul. I think the public reception that our audit committee is transparent, and then we're bringing in other sets of eyes to look at that, and that a non-board member is sitting there, and it's not just the board having control over it. I think that outweighs that. Okay. And so, Paul, this slide right here on the structure, I think it gives us a chance to fill out the expertise area. And audit committees are, charged with a lot of technical issues, not just the financial reporting themselves, but, analyzing risk, right, Paul, when different risks are there. And you've got just a lot of external things that can affect an audit process that we could fill out with risks. Yeah, the one I see, Paul, at most is an organization gets, weren't involved with grants. Now they're in with grants. It's really nice to have, assuming those board members haven't been involved with grants before, to have an expertise with someone who's been through the grant process and communicate with the auditors. So I think these always outweigh. The appointment cycle is interesting. making sure that you have this down and understand, how you're going to appoint people onto this. Paul, the thing where I see this is, and I am totally biased. I'm going to come clean on this for everybody, but oftentimes organizations will assign all their committees at the point in time when their board is flipping over or a certain point in time of the year. And I just think the audit committee, because of the independence of it and everything, it can't be like, oh, we have a slot on the audit committee and we're just going to slot someone in here. I think it's more of a recruitment. Paul, you used that word before, to recruit people onto this committee. And it reflects on the reputation of the organization, have that committee, that audit committee seated with the right people. It means everything else is going to go smoother, including indirectly affecting the cost on an audit, because smooth affects time. So I think take a look at this and, be aware that, people sitting on this could be sitting on executive committee, finance committee and such. Size, we talked about the 3 to 5. I think here we've covered this, Paul. The chair of the committee, that person, I look at it as the expertise in that area is the same as the general resume I'm looking for for a treasurer, to have that experience, strong background.
Yeah, and Mike, one question came in alongside this thinking about the skill set, and the question was, so they should have training to understand the regulations and financials. Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, ideally, you've got all the members have some sort of financial background. We don't live in a perfect world, though, right, Mike?
No. And you're always going to have some skill set. And don't remind yourself, these are volunteers. And, sometimes they might even have the expertise but not have the time to do this. But we're going to talk about these two on the bottom here, Paul, a little bit later on. But I think it's the first time they should surface, that when you get someone there, that if you could have, not for every position in the audit committee, but for the chair to have a job description. Less is more. A couple of paragraphs of the key things that they're doing. And that's a living document. You can be updating that over time. And I think that really helps with recruiting, but also the new person coming in to say, hey, here's your role defined. And the charter for the audit committee would be for the committee itself, not just for the chair. What are the rule? What are the order? What are our responsibilities? And again, less is more, just a couple of paragraphs. And we're going to go over those a little bit more later on. The staff liaisons, think about this. And I think, I wanted to spend just a minute here, Paul, watching the time, but that on near the bottom there about, having that CEO. My general tendency is to, definitely we're going to have the chief, someone in the finance department, the key person there. But I also like to show that the CEO is vested in this process and not firewall them off. This doesn't mean they're sitting on the committee, but they're like acting as a liaison, attending these meetings and such. How do you feel about having that, CEO interacting with the committee?
Like many things in life, I don't think there's a clear-cut answer here, right? I think it depends on the size of the organization, the sophistication. I don't think it's a bad thing ever. I think it comes down to capacity and just how much time they have.
And if you're blessed to have both committees, have a way for the chair of the audit committee to talk with the chair of the finance committee, which is most likely going to be the treasurer, and for them to communicate. Doesn't mean to take away from the independence of it. Operating cycle, real quick, having a calendar we're going to go through is key. I think, Paul, I love when I get to, as a volunteer or working as a CFO for an organization, to be able to hand the auditors a calendar up front and just say, here's our normal cycle, here's our key meeting dates, here's our deliverable dates, and such. I just think it sets a tone for that and such. And we're going to talk about, we have some sample calendars at the end we're going to show. Meeting agendas for audit committees. These are different than a finance committee. And the meeting cycle, when the audit committee meets, Paul, I'm going to go so far as that when an audit committee meets, each agenda during that 12-month cycle will look different. Because you take a membership committee, a fundraising committee, even a finance committee, they sort of have general pieces that they're covering each time. Each of those meetings is going to, it's like we're going to have the risk assessment meeting. We're having the meeting when the reports are received. We're having a meeting for approval process. each one of those are going to be different. So Paul and I think we should be laying out the meeting agendas ahead of time. And that could be part of that charter. You can have those on file for the groups. Not that they couldn't, highlight those. And highlighting the key deliverable dates will make the whole process go better. Defining the beginning and end of the cycle, Paul, it's a circle. It never ends. But I think to look at that, and what's such, and I don't like the auditor continuance and presentation to the board. It could either be the beginning or the end, depending on how you look at the circle. It ends when we present to the board, right, for final approval, or is that the beginning of the next cycle? How did it go? Are we continuing with the next auditor, which we usually do, but nothing lasts forever. And you can argue that for a new audit committee seated, that current committee has just spent time with the audit team and everything and such. So I think
and I think the calendar is especially important too. And I would encourage those of you who serve on audit committees, loop your auditor in on the timeline early, right? Because a lot of CPA firms do schedule out months ahead of time, and if you tell them what they want, we can generally make it happen. We just need to know. And then from a continuance perspective, a couple of thoughts there. I agree with Mike. I think you should always formally say we are appointing them as our auditing firm for X year, even if you're not going for a rotation. And also know too, right? Like there's different best practices and thoughts on when to do an RFP, but one tool I use quite a bit, and again, taking aside my auditor hat, putting on my audit committee hat, is asking the team internally to rotate personnel. And that doesn't always have to be the partner. Sometimes a more powerful rotation could be a manager or senior manager, another team member. So there's a question in the chat, Mike. It's funny, this came in. I wasn't going there, but I will. The question is, how often should we send RFPs to replace our outside auditors? I'm going to take away the replace word here, being very independent. I think you should evaluate rotation, not necessarily of an audit firm, but of personnel every 5 to 7 years. And I'm not telling you don't do an RFP. Just think about all the other things going on in the background, right? Because switching auditing firms is disruptive. And I say this as I would love to be the auditor for all of you, but I'm just being honest here. There is a significant time and investment that goes along with changing auditing firms. Wouldn't you agree, Mike?
100%. We've got a little section towards the end, Paul, on this. But if you think of it from a positive perspective, asking the question each year is not saying you're changing auditors. It will help from a positive perspective, managing the process. Little things like, this is going great, but we've had the same team. A quick reminder to the audit team, like, can we start to rotate some personnel? We want to keep this going, okay? And it's a chance for the auditor during that process to talk about, things that they want to see a little differently. But if you go years without even asking the question, Paul, that's the key. I think it's asked every year. So you don't have to, whether you're on a 3-year, 7-year, 10-year cycle, whatever, it's different for each organization. But generally, the relationships will last longer if the question is brought up every year. It will not encourage, turnover auditor. It's just a powerful thing to do. And the new audit committee orientation, I think, happens each year. I'm sort of soft on this for other committees and then even a board. But the audit committee orientation is not about the process. It's also about what went great in the last process. What are we trying to do better? And you need to reset that clock each year. So Paul and I firmly push that. So, Ryan, sorry, it took us a little time to get to our first polling question. We got 3 here. But Paul, can you go ahead and take this one?
Sure. First polling question. Do you have a separate audit committee or do you rely on a different committee? Something like a finance committee for audit oversight. Yes, no, and if yes, do you have standard operational procedures? Again, please do answer to get credit, and we welcome any feedback in the comments.
And we get extra credit for yes and yes. No, nothing. No, it's really there's situations where it's not appropriate to have both. It's based on size, complexity, structure. There's a lot of situations that go on here. But this is for our curiosity, right, Paul? How's it shaping up?
Unscientifically, it looks like we're about 50% split, which I would say is not that uncommon, especially with smaller organizations that I've seen. I think really as you get larger, that's where there are delineated committees most of the time. But looks like for this audience, it's about 50-50.
Yeah, and I would say that would be my guess. And if we even, triple the size, it would still probably be about 50-50. So let's go through just some perception areas. We'll be able to move quicker. We appreciate you letting us get those basic building block issues out there. We think, Paul and I talked about this the other day. We had a related presentation we were doing that we always got to get over this hurdle of perception. You could walk up to probably if you put 100 board members in a room and ask them, is the audit committee important? 100 out of 100 are going to say yes, but they can't often answer this question of why, why they exist. And I think that's a self-inflicted wound, Paul, that we need to go out of our way and spend a few minutes with the board, because it starts there. Why do you have this audit committee? Why are they important? Understand that. And if they don't understand that, the thing that's highlighted, Paul, I mean, we could end the presentation right here. We won't, Riley, but it's right there that oftentimes the wrong people get on this committee. They're volunteers. A little thought, we can get the right people on this committee and make the process so much stronger. So that's the key about this. And so everything else will fall into play here. If we have the right people in the committee, it'll help them in understanding the job they're going to do. But I have seen it where, Paul, worst case scenario is board members who didn't show up to the board orientation, they got signed to the audit committee because it wasn't the most exciting committee to volunteer for versus going out and
You mean
recruit.
everyone doesn't want to be on the audit committee naturally?
I know that's what we're supposed to think, but no. It's oftentimes as a default. And I got a couple funny stories to tell about that, but we'll hold that for another day. So really, we got to work on changing the perception. I think fiduciary is an important word, but that scares people. Okay? And so we need to explain that in a positive way, how we can help them fulfill their fiduciary duties, okay? That, first they have to be independent in their mindset and understand through that charter what they're adding. And so you'll see we talked about these briefly later on, but to answer the fiduciary duties, Paul, I think for the chair, it's in the job description. And having a working guideline, a working plan, whatever you want to call it, a charter for that meeting, for that committee. And then beefing all that up by pairing it with a start of the meeting. I had an audit committee. It was really interesting where they didn't want to have auditor orientation committee meetings, but we did have them. We just called them a different name. It was, the beginning of the, start the audit cycle process meeting, a reset meeting, whatever you want to call it. Because orientation I could see the chair's point of view was like orientation is implying we don't know what we're doing. And so they just called it a reset meeting. You just start, or a starting point for the next time. But those three together will really go hand in hand. And that job description, Paul, I don't know if the board members will read it. I would love to give that job description to the full board. Make it part of their board packet. Hopefully they'll read a little. They need to see what the chair of this committee is doing.
Yeah, and I think that's a good best practice for a chair of any committee, right? Because how do you know if you're effectively doing your job if you don't know what your job is?
Yep. And you'll see down on the bottom, it says it's just not just for the audit committee. It's sharing those reports. Paul, you as an auditor, if you come in and it's brand new client, and you see like, oh, they got a job description, they got a working calendar, they got these things. It's in the board packet. You start to say, this is important to them, right? You get a different feel for it.
Okay, we've got our next polling question here. And as a reminder, please do submit your answer in the chat so you can get CPE credit. Here's the question. Do you believe your board members generally understand the important responsibilities and operational purposes of an audit committee? I'm chuckling to myself because I don't think this is going to be all yeses, but we'll see how honest everyone is right now.
Yeah, we're expecting the default question to be no, and that's okay because that means we have areas that we can. It's part of the time we're just super busy, and a few minutes will help here.
Yeah, and I'd love your most humorous misunderstanding in the comments, or just any of them you've seen.
Yeah, here and also Paul and I would love any tactics you use to help a board to get comfortable with that. The tactic I stole many years ago from a board that had in their standard board packet, they had a brief 1 or 2 sentence description of each committee. And one of those committees was the audit committee. But I thought that was really a powerful thing to have in the board packet. A brief description of each committee, not just a listing of the committees. So what's it look like, Paul?
This is another one where I think we've got 50-50 yes and no's.
Okay. And I think, to repeat one thing we're going to move on here, is that having those description of committees in the board packet is good. And to personalize your description of the audit committee and finance committee. Have them sitting next to each other. Don't just do a quick AI, just a general blurb. Talk about your audit committee a little bit. But not that I always start, you can start with AI there, but try to personalize that. Okay, Paul, this is our lead up to this is our key section here. It'll only take us a few minutes to get through this, but how can we add value? Okay, and so on the value added is we need to raise board awareness levels and include this in the board training. And here are the areas that we think that you can add value to. There's a difference, Paul, between oversighting risk and managing the risk. An audit committee is well positioned to say, hey, we could, I think, Paul, I don't think there's an internal control system that can't be fiddled with, to be nice, updated, added to, made a little stronger, right? Always. There's always new things. There's always new risks perking out. Different people are involved. And so I always like to talk to audit committees and say, just not oversight. They have real opinions about some things that could really, I've seen some great ideas come out of audit committees that not just managing the risk, but even on efficiency. You can be oversighting something too much, right?
Yeah, no, I think all of these are great. Again, I'll go back to a point you made earlier. If you do have separate and audit and finance committees, just make sure there's no overlapping responsibilities. Again, being sensitive to everyone's time, just make sure each committee has clear delineated responsibilities. I say that to say, Mike, for example, one of the ones you have here, financial oversight, sometimes I see finance committees charged with that.
Exactly. And then auditor selection, Paul, this is not about auditor continuance. It's just that when and if you get to that auditor selection process, understand that it's not the auditor's fault. An organization that's very small, shouldn't be considering just super large firms. You got to find that, match to, what are you looking for skills and things and such. And in the auditor selection process, you should be talking about the benefits of your organization. It's good reputation. You're going to be ready on time and all, trying to make the process easy. Help with the financial oversight. Again, here, this is where the audit committee and the finance committee have a rolling conversation after the audit's over. What could be done better, faster, stronger in the future? And because of the independence, Paul, I think a lot of organizations, they understand that they could put the whistleblower protection management of that process in the audit committee, but oftentimes it doesn't end up there. I don't know why, but I just think they don't take advantage of that.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Mike, get it in the description of the committee.
So are the changes needed? I think every committee, every year can be a little better. We're dealing with volunteers. We need to be actively supporting those volunteers. Paul, I love what you said in the very beginning. It can be a great seeding ground for future, board members, leaders of the organization. Help people who are a new board member. They can get involved very quickly on an audit committee and feel like they're adding value. Some board members, it takes years before they feel like they're helping the organization. They can jump in. It's a great place to help them get started. And I think that second point on the bottom there, where are the skills needed? Constantly look at that. There's no audit committee that's perfect, right, Paul? But where are we where are we missing some expertise on this committee? Ask that question. And is the committee complementary, working together? And asking if people if they would like to serve versus assigning that authority is a really important part. Now, the whistleblower part of it, I'm a little split on this, Paul, because I think to effectively do these whistleblower protection, there's third parties that we see used, and those services I think work really well and becoming more efficient and packaged that we can outsource that, and that shows independence, right? Would you agree with that statement, right?
I've seen it done both ways. I think there's a cost element to it. I think it's understanding the risks involved and the volume of complaints you're getting. I think all that goes into whether you do it quote unquote internally versus using a third party source.
With that said, Paul, the connection can be through the audit committee, though. If you use a third party or don't, or some combination, the funnel can be the chair of the audit committee or the committee itself. And I think that really enhances that process. So what's happening is the audit committee is picking up the responsibility, but not most of the work. It's a little hard for them. In some groups, it works great. The audit committee can manage the whistleblower process. Okay. Also, seeing that audit committees are in position because of their independence to take on ethics roles, right? Or even some large organizations, the audit committee can act as a parliamentarian when there's an issue that comes up of a governance, you know, type compliance issue. And this piece on the bottom is my favorite one too, and I learned this with it was a larger organization, but they had about 7 people in the audit committee, Paul, at that time, and large organization, multi entities. They rotated their audit committee members to sometime during the year to sit on other committees just to observe, not sit formally on the committee, but to attend a committee meeting, have a dialogue. And my favorite one, because you think about it, is to have an audit committee member attend a fundraising committee meeting, because that's where you see like big risks of an organization. I mean, yeah, there's always a risk of a diversion of asset or fraud. A bigger risk is making an agreement with a donor or a grant funder, to do something. We really don't have the capacity. We don't have the skill set, or promises made to a donor, or how does this look, your reputational. So I love having audit committee members do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Said another way, how can you really understand the risks of an organization if you're not ingrained in the various operational areas as delineated by those committees? I don't think you can really understand the risk if all you're operating in is the finance world.
100% agree with that statement. And when that audit committee member sits in on a fundraising, a membership committee, that they spend 5 minutes just introducing themselves and talking about what the audit committee is doing this year, what they've seen. So all of a sudden now we've done that orientation. So this is one of our favorite tips here, and zero cost. And it's great where leads to this, Paul, that I think the audit committee should stay active all year long. I know that's a leap of faith. But so many times, they start and then, okay, we'll see you when the next audit, getting near the next audit. And I think they should not go silent. Would you agree with that statement?
I agree. And I think that goes back to the point earlier you had about the calendar, right? And just planning it out. So let's say in this hypothetical world, we plan out 4 audit committee meetings. Are all of those going to be 100% comprised of audit content? Probably not. But if you get those meetings on the calendar and maybe one of them, even if you don't have an ERM program, is geared toward discussing risks, then you're having that conversation, right? And that's what's the worst thing that could happen, Mike?
Exactly. And larger groups that do a formal ERM sort of risk assessment once a year have a member of the audit committee just sit in for better or worse and such. And and if you've gone out of your way to seat that committee, Paul, that committee is going to be, by being more active, is going to be more engaged, but more up to tune with what's going on in the organization versus going silent for 6 months or maybe even longer, because their audit process is a pretty tight schedule. So this is our second biggest thing, along with, who we seat on that committee, and have them be active all year long. And then, as Paul said, with that calendar, you could start to assign different functions. It's the only committee, Paul, I'm going to repeat myself from the beginning, where I think if you break it down quarterly, they have almost like a different job to do each quarter. And you could affect that in the calendar and the meeting agendas. And that brings us up to this. I think you do the 4 meetings a year, and they don't all have to be long. And understand that during the intense audit process, so they might have meetings between. Where we just had our quarterly meeting, but we're 3 weeks away from presentation of financial draft reports or something. Or we have a separate meeting just for risk assessment.
Yeah, like with many things we've talked about during this presentation, there's no one size fits all. If you're smaller, less complex, maybe the quarterly schedule works. Or conversely, if you have, for example, an internal audit function, you have a very comprehensive ERM process, then maybe you need to meet 6 times a year. Just take a look at everything and make the right decision for your organization.
Yeah, and if you have 4 meetings a year and you just had a couple because of the audit, you could say, hey, we don't need, the September quarter meeting, and you could defer that. So this is our polling question number 3.
Okay, how often does your organization's audit committee meet during the year? We got 2, 3, 4 monthly. And then do you meet only during the audit process? Again, make sure to respond in the comments so you can get your CPE credit.
So what's it looking like, Paul?
We've got a diversity of answers on this one. We're all across the board. Yeah,
This is good.
this one I cannot adequately use my mathematical skills to give you a percentage. I think we've gotten the only one we haven't gotten is B, which doesn't surprise me. Um, but I've seen 2, I've seen 4, I've seen monthly. You know, I'll tell you what I see the most. I'm not saying this is right, Mike. What I see the most is A, 2 meetings, and C, 4 meetings. And to your point, Mike, I think 4 is probably where I'd line up if I was creating my ideal schedule for a non-complex organization.
Well, Paul and I are used to getting beat up, so if you want to blame us for adding more audit committee meetings, I'm sure the organization will benefit. So go ahead.
Hey, we're happy to take the blame.
Okay, we have 2 quick takeaways. We're just going to do a few minutes on each one. And you've heard us talk about this audit planning calendar. And up on the website, we gave you a post, and we'll give you another link to it. Having the audit planning calendar out there ahead of time, Paul, I call it a living document. You have a basic calendar you put together, and before each year starts is, what are we doing differently? And differently can be just small, subtle changes to the schedule. Oh, our annual meeting moved a month. That can affect the audit planning calendar, right? Just lots of little things that can happen. And I think auditors, there isn't an auditor on the planet that wouldn't appreciate getting that calendar on the front end, right?
Yeah, I'm a planner. I love scheduling calendar appointments. And here's the thing too. It's not going to be the same every year. Good example, a client of mine is going through a detailed system implementation process this year. Does that change the timing for the audit? You better believe it. I think everyone who's been through that knows that takes a lot of time and effort. And you should consider not just the audit process when you make this schedule, but what else operationally is going on with your organization and who has responsibility for that.
So Paul and I just want to give you, here's the 7 sections, what you have in each section. The sub-bullets is up to you. But Paul, I think you could build off of this. You could have 8. You could combine some of these into 5. But having the pre-planning meetings, we feel like this is worth its weight in gold. And have that extra, I call it an extra meeting, Paul. You, Johnson Lambert, I know you guys do it right, but that upfront meeting, it's a little less like compliance based. It's more like get to know you, everybody good, how's it gone since we last talked to you, and it just sets the stage. And then invariably something will come up in there that will make the audit process better. And then you have your risk assessment meeting, the release of trial balance, start of field work, when drafts are coming, the concluding process, and where is that approval, and it starts over again. So we always think that the planning team is, and Paul, basically you hit this, have the planning calendar, and and just look at it. And it could be the first step in the next audit cycle or the last step of the audit concluding. It's a circle for us. If I had to get one out, I think, before everybody leaves we were approving the audit, just pull it up and say, hey, you know what? If we had this first meeting 1 week earlier, we would have avoided X, Y, Z or something.
Yeah, and if you've ever been in the situation where you say, "Oh, our audit's drifting," or "We've never stuck to schedule," let me tell you, as someone who has been in this process, there is no better motivational tool for getting your audit done on time than having a calendar and politely saying, "Here's what we expect." Now, that's not to say all the time it's going to line up with that. Things happen during an audit that can require additional testing. Other operational priorities can occur, but having that plan is extremely beneficial in my perspective.
100%. And Paul, that's why I like doing it at the end of the cycle. And what Paul said is like that last paragraph right there. It reduces the chance of something repeating. Paul, oftentimes it's not something super unusual. It's something pretty boring that we say, "Oh man, we could have fixed that," right?
Yep.
And it just has a huge impact. And then, Paul, we're just going to finish with a couple of minutes before sending it back to Riley on auditor continuance. And I like this. It's an annual question, not an annual change. And it's sort of like, going to the doctor for an annual physical or something. You're better off not waiting, right? Just ask the question. And you believe it or not, people think that you're not being negative to your auditor. It's actually being respectful. And you end up with a relationship that will last longer by asking the question annually. It's just my personal opinion.
I agree. Again, even though I want to be your auditor forever, I think you always have to ask that question, just saying, are we getting a good quality service? Are we getting value out of this service? And does the relationship work?
Perfect. And so, auditor continue. I think it's a procedural question. It could be in that charter. It could be on the calendar. And it could be on your checklist. I've seen audit committees that have certain checklist functions that they want to do, just to make sure we don't miss something. Again, Paul, you outlined like the length of service, evaluating performance, and such. But, Paul, we always talk about when there's been a negative or a disaster situation. 90% of the time, it's going good. And you want that to continue good. And it gives you a chance to and say to the auditors, or to say the auditors say to you, there was one little hiccup that we both could have saved some time and money, right? And let's get that solved here. And
Yeah.
such.
A
So,
couple of questions as we roll it up here, Mike, that I can give quick answers to. Risk assessment, is this related to organization wide or just on fraud, complaints, and financial? Organization wide is the right answer. Again, going back to, I don't think you can truly understand financial risks if you don't understand operational considerations, because those two are interchangeably linked.
right. And organizations are evolving when you add that. So
Yeah.
it's also looking ahead. Like, it might not be an issue now, but next year this organization's getting its first what? Grant, doing something. There's always some first every year, right, Paul? And understanding that. And where that is. And also, don't forget about transitional issues. This organization is transitioning its CEO for the first time in 20 years or something, or we're moving. So, you have a comment on the first step or last step? I already told you I like it as the last step of the cycle.
Yeah, I think it's good to reflect on it while it's fresh in your mind. And you can't, now that's not to say you'll formally do it, but at least have that conversation to say, hey, what are we thinking for next year as we've just went through this process? Did it work or did it not work? And just to hit on another question that was in the chat, the question
Sure.
was, is it the same auditor or the same audit firm? We're speaking first at the firm level, but again, to my point earlier, that's not to say you couldn't ask for a rotation of certain team members. That can be extremely beneficial.
Exactly. And all that. And I think, Paul, back to the positive aspect, and this is the last slide, Riley, is it actually makes for a more successful long term relationship by asking this each time, And both approaches work, whether it's the first or last. I do want to put in the pros of starting it with the next cycle is you get that next audit committee together. They're reviewing the notes and reports and was there any management letter or findings and all that, and they can start fresh. The good side about being with the last last thing to do is that with more time and if you need a change or rotate team members, both the firm and the organization have more time to pivot. Right, Paul? You can't ask for a change of team members, a couple weeks before the audit process starts, right? That's hard. And just like if you're...
I'm going to say that's going to have a low chance of success.
Right. So that's why I think, we stored a key towards the last step of, the concluding process. So we feel like, Paul and I wanted to bring some things to your awareness. I think 90% of what we talked about, Paul, has zero cost. It's more of awareness and using this, and it'll have a positive impact on the organization and the reputation of the organization, which to me at the end of the day is, if your reputation ever gets dinged, that's hard to fix. We can fix everything else, but not the reputation.
Great. Well, really appreciate everyone's time. We're going to pass it back to Riley, but if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Mike and I, and you can see our contact information listed on the next couple of slides.
Yep. And Riley, you'll make the PowerPoint slides available. You'll see how to get a hold of us and to the website. So we appreciate that.